Hi Priyank, good evening and good morning to all of them who have attended. So thank you Priyank for the kind introduction, and thank you Arita for giving us the opportunity, both Priyank and team. So I'm Kiran, and along with me is Vivek. Uh, Today we are going to talk about a topic called metrics for engineering excellence. So before we get into more detail into this, first let's try to understand what is engineering excellence. So we did some homework on this. We were thinking what can be the best definition of it, and then we sort of came up with this: delivering the software you can be proud of, right? So I mean there it rests. So in this so why we came up with this topic is because me, Vivek, and another friend of ours, Guru, we all three are writing a book on agile metrics, metrics for agile tech teams. So while we were writing a book, we thought we'll also share it with the audience and get feedback, and we can improve some of the things in the book right away, like as you give us feedback, and we can improve on some of these things. So we have picked few topics from the book, and we'll be sharing it with you. So this is how it goes. We'll be presenting you three pairs of metrics. So when I say pair, we'll present one metric which is bad, and we'll present one metric which can be used instead of the bad metric. So we'll be discussing three pairs of metrics. So the first pair, right? I mean the first metric, code coverage. I think everybody might have heard about this. So code coverage, what is code coverage? Right? Let's say you have a you have a file, so I mean .jsx or whatever language you're writing. So so what your automated test suite does is it'll just see how many lines of code it's covering. Let's say it covered out of this 10 lines, it has like 10 lines your source code, and it covers 3 lines of it. And now we say your test coverage is what, 30%, since it covered 3 out of 10 lines. So 30% is your code coverage. And generally teams measure this as a quality metric. Let's say we have 100 lines of code and we write no, we aim for at least 60-70% code coverage, no, and make sure that we have written enough number of tests so that more number of lines of codes are lines of code is covered, and then we tell, okay, this is a the product is of a good quality. So typically, this is the graph it looks. So teams generally aim for 60 to 70% and try to maintain it over a period of time. Usually, when team starts it for the first time, they'll have 0% and they aim for 60%. And once the threshold is reached, as and when they write new source code, new code, they make sure that they have written, you know, the test case as well for those extra lines source of code. So now, is it a good coverage? What is wrong with this? Let's try to understand it with an example. So we have a source code, and we have a function. So what this function does is it will just tell you whether a given number is odd or even. This is the source code. And what we did, we return a test case for it. And this is how the test case looks, right? And what does this test do? So it will just see whether it will just it's not even a test case. If you see here, it is what it is doing, it is just passing, it is just calling that function and passing the number 2, and the same thing it's doing, it's just again calling the function and calling the number, passing the number 3. But if you see the code coverage here, it is 100%. But is it really a good test case? Right, it's not a good test written here, but your code coverage says 100%, right? So even though you have not written a good test here, your coverage is still 100%. This is one of the way how it can be wrong. So what we do, okay, so we show it to the developer. So this is what is wrong. It doesn't even have an assert statement. So when you ask developers, okay, let's say this doesn't have an assert statement, let me put an assert, assert statement. So here also what it is doing, it is just calling assert not null, right? And what this does is it is just checking whether the even or odd function, it is returning null or not, right? When you pass to, what happens? It'll replace that, if x mod 2 is equal to 0, if 2 mod 2 is equal to 0, then return even. So it is returning even, which is not null. Now also your test passed, but is it a good quality test? No, but still your code coverage tells you have 100% test coverage, right? And this is one of the wrong things. But actually, if we write a proper test case, this is how it looks, right? Assert equals, and what we do is we are expecting even when we give the number 2, and we are expecting odd when we pass the number 3. Only when this happens, tell the test case is pass, right? This is where, and if I run a 100, if I run a test coverage now, even now the result will be 100% test coverage. So if this case is there, okay, all good, but your even your code coverage makes good, but does it really make sense, to use the code coverage in all other cases? So what can we use? So as I discussed, so we will know. Yeah. So what is wrong with this? So it ensures only that people are writing tests, right? So so let's say you have a team and we have not even writing test cases. So you can start off with this, code coverage, if you have not written any test. But already you have a code coverage and already you are writing tests. This may not be a good metric, right? And it does not ensure quality of tests. Like you already saw, it is just seeing whether test is written or not, and it will never measure whether the test is of good quality or not. And sometimes just developers just write test, just to make it pass, right? Sometimes there is a deployment, production deployment pressure, and they just have to make it, the code coverage look 65% or 75%. So what developers do, sometimes they just make some tests and make it pass, like we saw the earlier examples. And also every time you run a build, right, these amount of tests keep running, right? And the execution time is wasted, and every time you are running a test which doesn't make sense, right? So these are the things which is wrong in code coverage. I wouldn't say it's completely wrong. To start off, yes, we can start with this, but does it make you an excellent engineering team? No. So instead of code coverage, what can we use? So there is something called mutation coverage, right? And what is mutation coverage? Let's say you have a mutation testing tool, and you have your code.js like we saw earlier. So what it does is it intentionally introduces bugs into your system, into your code.js. And now when you introduce intentional bugs, your test should fail, right? And if your test fails, your mutation testing is good. That means your code is of good quality. If it doesn't fail, it will report how many mutation is found and how many are not killed, and it will provide you a report. So here it's basically not only checking you have written test, and it's also checking if you have written a good test. And there are some external, there are some open source tools, Striker, and these things can be used, and it's pretty easy to integrate it with your system. And let's see how it actually works. Let's take an example, right? The same example which we discussed. We have a function which gives, which tells a given number is odd or even. Now, and this is the test we have written. So now what it does, now the mutation testing tool, what it does, it replaces x mod 2 with x plus 2. It is just changing the mod into plus. Now, ideally, what should happen? Your tests should fail, because you have changed your source code itself. Your test should fail, right? But here what happens? So since here your tests are still passing. Like you see, if you still pass 2 there, it's still returning expected. So now your tests are passed, which is not supposed to pass. And let's take another example. So now your mutation survived. So how they call it, your mutation got survived, because if your bug, if your system catches the bug and if your test fail, they say the mutation got killed. If it, if your test passes without catching the change in code, then what it says, your mutation has survived. So let us take another example and replace equal to with probably less than or greater than or whatever you feel like. I mean, it does, the test suit takes care of itself. And now again, your test will pass because it's still running the same function, same test case which you have written, and it is giving an expected result, and still again your test pass, which means your mutation is survived. So now what it does, your mutation tool will give you a coverage. What it tells, 0 out of 2 mutations killed. That means 0% mutation coverage. So let's say if the first case had not survived, if it would have been, it would have told kill, right? Then it would have probably given 50% mutation coverage. That means 50% of your tests are of good quality. Other 50% is not of good quality. So this is how it looks. And can you go next slide? Yeah. So here, if you see, this is a typical example of mutation test report. This is how it shows. You can see that there is one file, and it has like it had like a total 32 tests, and 24 of them got killed, 8 of them survived. That means 8 of them are not of good quality, right? You should see which are all those tests and write a proper test for those. And similarly for other things. So there is another example where it is telling there is 100%, which means there is only 4 test cases total, and for all the 4, the mutation got killed. That means your test cases are of good quality. And what are the uses of this compared to code coverage? We saw this measures true quality of test. Right, earlier code coverage just used to see, what it does is it just sees the number of lines of code covered, and that's it. So here it measures true quality of tests, and it gives you a report. And it's easy, and it's of no cost, because open source tools are available, like I already showed you, Striker. And apart from this, it's really easy to integrate into your CI/CD pipeline. It's just running couple of commands, and you can start using your mutation test tool. So this is one pair. So what we discussed till now, I'll just quickly summarize. So we discussed what is code coverage, and what are the disadvantages of code coverage, and why it is not a good thing to use code coverage as a quality metric. Instead of code coverage, what we can use is we can use mutation coverage. And we discussed different kinds of test cases examples, and we also saw some of the open source tools, and yeah. Okay, I
Okay.
think let's discuss the second pair now. Yeah, we will.
Okay. So the second pair of metrics are going to be around your CI/CD related stuff. So there is no engineering excellence without talking about CI/CD. So this second pair of metrics is about how you can use your build results in order to build a culture of engineering excellence. That's what it is going to be. So as Kiran has set a trend of telling a metric which is widely popular and people think it is a good metric, and then we debunk saying, okay, it's not as good metric as we think it is, and we will call it as a bad metric, and we will go and reason why it is a bad metric, and then we will introduce a good metric. So following that trend, I am showing you the second pair's first metric, which we think is not so good metric, which is called a build failure count. Right? So what is build failure count? The name is very pretty self-explanatory. You count the number of times your build has failed. That's all. And you just track it over a period of time. And that's how it works. So how to measure build failure count if you're a team that is just starting, or anybody who starts a continuous integration practice? This is a very common pattern. They have an automatic build server, which will take any code change, right? Any code change goes into the automatic build server, and the automated build server, what it does is it tries to integrate the new change with the already existing code. And after integrating, it tries to create a build, or it tries to create a package of the software. And if it is able to do that, and also while it is building, while it is packaging, it is also it also tries to do a lot of things. It runs some unit tests, sometimes it runs some integration tests, and a lot of things it does. You can configure the automated build server or the CI server to do as many things as you want in order to make sure that the integrated software is of good quality, right? Assuming that all these things are there, what this automated build server will do is, if everything is okay, all good, then it will mark that particular change or that particular build as passed, which we call as a green build. So if you use any tool like Jenkins, Travis, and I think there is a CI system that comes integrated with Heroku. Generally, green color is associated with a successful build, right? That is all good. In case something goes wrong, right? In case, let's say, a test fails, in case something compilation fails, in case the integration merge fails, in case, your code is not able to create a package because of some files are missing, lot of reasons could happen. Because of this, what happened, you could get a not okay result where the build is not successful, and the build server will mark that particular build as a red build or a bad build or a failed build, right? So this is basically the assumption that we have, that a team has just started or team has been using automated build server, and they understand what is a red build and they understand what is a green build, right? So any new change that goes through the automated build server has a result of either good or bad. This is the idea behind this metric. Now, what people do when they measure this build failure count is they concentrate on the red builds. So they start capturing how many red builds happened over a period of time. So for example, let's say your frequency of red builds is too high. So what you do, every day you calculate, every day I am going to count how many red builds happened today and try to put that in a chart. Let's say you have very less, over a week you want to do, let's say you improved, and some teams are doing that also. Say they improved and they reduce the number of red builds in a day. They move towards, okay, let's try to reduce the weekly count, and they go to a weekly count. So this is how people think that they are improving in their journey by reducing the red builds. So the assumption behind this is that red builds are bad, right? And red builds are something that we frown upon, and we as an organization or we as an engineering team should have very high quality, should have very high engineering excellence. So we will reduce the number of builds, red builds, over a period of time by being extremely careful not to break anybody's work. This is the idea behind reducing the build. So now let us say you count the number of red builds and draw a graph. How does it look? It looks very similar to this. The typical usage is this. X-axis, I am targeting weeks, or you could even put days here. So first week, second week, third week, fourth week. And there is a build failure count that goes into the Y-axis. Now what you do, first week, let's say there are 10 build failures. You put that dot there and you start plotting a dot every week. You could even do bars, not necessarily dots here. You could even do bars if you want a better way to present this. Now what you do is you already have set a target, right? So typically what happens, the head of engineering or head of quality assurance or somebody who has an engineering function, right? They come and say, hey, we want to measure how good is our CI system, how good our developers are, and we want to build quality products. So the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of technical leads and engineering leads is to basically create a target for how many build failures are we going to create, how are we going to reduce this. So we created 100 build failures in the last week, so we are going to reduce it by 20%. It sounds so good. It's like a story that you can tell anybody, and it conforms to the norms of how metrics are seen in the traditional world. So this looks very good on paper. So if you see this team has reduced their red builds over a period of time, and they are so close to reaching the target, maybe give them 1 or 2 weeks more, they might actually reach the target. That's how it looks. And so and what it creates, if you create a chart like this, and let's say you show this a week on week or month on month on in your, let's say, even your sprint review, or let's say you are looking at this chart in the sprint retrospective and you are trying to realize, okay, how can we make sure that this did not happen next time? If you are doing all these things, what you are essentially creating is basically a blame the build breaker culture, right? So you are trying to reduce something because the mental model is that red builds are bad. So what you are trying to do is, since if a person breaks a build, this chart gets affected for the team, and the team frowns upon that person who made their chart look bad. right? It has a very similar effect to the velocity chart where, if one story does not complete, or there is one popular term called spillover, right? If a story spills over for even legitimate reasons, that person is frowned upon because, it is basically making the team look bad. So if a team has this kind of a chart, and assume that, in a leadership meeting, you are comparing multiple teams charts like this and seeing where each team is. And this basically puts the person who creates any build failure in a bad position. He is in a very bad place. Now, what happens is that because of this blame the build breaker culture, there are some bad effects, right? So let us talk about bad effects of what can happen when you measure build failure count, even though it looks very common sense, it looks very logical, right? So what happens is that the first problem is that we always seem to think that a bad or a red build is always because the person did not do their job well. A red build is because the person committed wrong code. A red build is because the person is not being disciplined, right? That is the general assumption. But actually, it is not true. There are 21 reasons. There is even a blog post that I authored about it where there are 21 reasons why a person will get wrongly blamed for a build failure for no fault of his own, right? Some of the reasons could be somebody else has written a new test case, and that is failing because of your new code, and when you integrate it fails. These kind of scenarios will make sure that a wrong person will get blamed. Typically the person who commits last will get blamed for any build failure that happens, right? So now, when this under this premise, what happens is that the bad effects, if you have to list the bad effects, very much similar to code coverage's bad effects. The first wrong thing in this, that getting the red builds early is the whole purpose of having a CI system. Why do you create a CI system? Because you want to catch things earlier, right? If you say that I should not have red builds at all, what are you doing with your CI system? You're effectively making it worthless, useless, right? So what we want to do is, we want the return of investment of the CI system is totally dependent on how many unavoidable red builds you are catching. That's the whole point, right? So when you reduce the number of red builds, then the ROI of your CI system goes very less, goes into negligible number. That is one. So you are totally destroying the purpose of having a CI system if you say over a period of time I should have 0 red builds. That's a bad thing. Second thing is that when you discourage a red build, we spoke about this already, it creates a dynamic of blame games. So people think red builds are bad. So one senior developer can question a junior developer saying, hey, why are you always creating red builds, and this is making our team look bad, and you have to make sure that you put a lot of effort before checking in any piece of code from tomorrow. This kind of conversations happen. And when these kind of conversations happen, what happens is a lack of psychological safety. The person who is a junior developer, or a person who creates red builds, the person whose code resulted in a red build, their psychological safety goes for a toss, and it affects their risk taking capability. And because risk taking capability goes for a toss, you would quickly see that people will not be okay with taking difficult or uncertain tasks. Whenever you have some integration points, right? Let us say you are working on a UI where you have to consume an external API, which you are not very sure about. You are not very, because it's a third party API. Now, people will be hesitant to take that work. They will say, no, we cannot start work unless, and they'll keep on postponing, and the valid delivery gets delayed. Because the underlying problem that people have is that I may create a build failure because of this unknown integration issue, and that will be blamed on me, and I do not want to look like a fool in front of my teammates. That is the psychology behind that. So people will always go against taking any difficult or any uncertain or anything with unknowns for that matter. That's the problem with measuring just the build failure count, even when you have the good intention of trying to reduce the downtime for the developers. That's about build failure count. Now, uh, this is just one part of it. There are other aspects of continuous integration which we talk about. So what can be good about, what can, if measuring build failure count is wrong, what can be measured instead? What is the alternate metric for you? So the alternate metric for you is called total build red time, right? You can even do an average build rate time. I'll explain what this is. Again, the name is like, you know what is a red build, right? And you know how much time the build has been read for a day. So I'll show you an example. So let us say, not let us say, there is 24 hours in a day. There are 24 hours in a day. And in these 24 hours, if you see this graph, first 4 hours, the build was in green state, which means, you know, last build was green and maybe the consequent builds were also green. No red build happened in this point. There may be multiple builds that could have happened. It's not a single build. Okay. So first 4 hours, no problems, no reds happen. And then after the fourth hour ended, one red build happened, right? And then the red build stayed red for a long time without getting fixed, right? It stayed for a um, long time before getting fixed. And then after 2 hours, again, it went to green because somebody fixed it. And then again, if you see, there is a 1 hour window where everything is red. Now, what happens is that what we have to measure is total build red time for a day, or if you want, you can even do it for a week, or you can average and say in a week, average build red time is this much. So for this case, it's 2 hours plus 1 hour is equal to 3 hours. This is the total build red time. And how can you use this? The idea is to reduce this number instead of build failure count. Though they appear to be very same numbers, the ideas are totally different. Instead of reducing the build failure count, you can aim to reduce the total build rate time. So the typical usage goes like this again. Total build rate time goes in y-axis, and in x-axis you have weeks, and you're going to reduce the total build rate time. Very similar. If you see, the characteristics are very similar. They will have a target of how many build rate time you should have, and the characteristics are extremely similar. But the only difference that this thing creates is the opposite of the effect of the previous thing. It is the appreciate the build fixer culture. Because you are trying to measure the downtime, this red time is nothing but a downtime for developers, because that is the time whenever a build is read, no developer can check in new code and get useful feedback from the CI server because the build is already read, right? So that is the reason why red time is something that we call as a downtime for a developer, right? You can even go and research about some terminologies called stop the line mentality. So whenever a build red happens, everybody drops what they are doing, swarms around and tries to get the build back to green. That is one mentality. That is one practice that you have in DevOps called stop the line. It dates back to even um, what is that called, even manufacturing industry, where whenever something bad happens in a manufacturing conveyor line, production line, uh, the moment a defect is found, stop the line so that no waste will be produced. That's the idea. So people stop the line. That's why it's called a downtime for developers. So we are trying to reduce the downtime. So any person who does a positive action gets appreciated here because they are making it go down in the direction that the team wants. So anybody who fixes a build is appreciated instead of any person who creates a build getting blamed, right? What did you change? Instead of just monitoring total number of build failures, you did a small shift into measuring the total build rate time, and this creates a new culture. And this is very important for an engineering team, right? Now, what are the tangible advantages of having this is that first, it creates a culture of fixing rather than blaming. So people will be more interested in rolling up their sleeves and jumping in and trying to fix the build. You can see a positive competition happening. This is one example, one advantage. And the second advantage is it reduces the lead time, because what we are hoping to reduce here, we are trying to reduce red time, which is the downtime. So if red time is reduced, and if the builds are fixed as quick as possible, the system will keep running for a very long time. So this effectively reduces the time taken for delivering something on production, right? You developers do not have to wait for a very long time before checking whether their code is okay, is it integrated well or not. So this enables a better flow for the developer. So why I use the word flow here is, if a developer is in a state of flow, he has done some code and he has checked in. Now, immediate thing that he wants to know is his code integrated into the main line and can it go to prod in the next deployment or not? Anything that stops him from getting that feedback as quick as possible, the developer's motivation goes down, right? Then that is when you see the developer being like, okay, fine, I'll go to the cafeteria, wait for some time, I'll probably watch cricket there and then come back and sit in my seat and see whether the build is fixed or not. That behavior happens because the developer's state of flow is interrupted. But when you hope to reduce the lead time, you get a better psychological flow for developers. Developers' motivation goes up. And the last thing is, whenever there is a huge red bar that you see in the graph, a lot of red time is there, which means uh, testers are going to get a lot of items in bulk at the end if you have a separate QA department in your team, or even if you have a separate UAT, or even if you have automated tests which are going to run, they are going to test a lot of things in a single batch, and increasing that batch size is going to difficult. Once a bug is identified in that huge batch, it is going to be very difficult to debug which caused that bug, because you have taken probably 50 commits and chunked them into a single commit, and you are giving it to the automation system, and it's very difficult to debug that. And even if human testers are there, it's going to get a last minute rush. They're going to get a last minute rush. So this is a good metric, because reducing this as a goal makes sure that you prevent the last minute rush. That's the idea here, right? So summarizing what I told, first metric was just count the number of build failures and aim to reduce them. That's the first metric. And the problem with that is, anybody who creates a red build is seen as a criminal, and that creates a blame mentality, and people will not be able to take risks. How do we flip that scenario? Instead of measuring number of build failures, measure something else, which is nothing but the build red time, which is the downtime, which means anybody who reduces the downtime is going to be treated as a person who is an achiever. So you can see positive competition in fixing things rather than blaming towards who did this and what happened, right? That's the culture change. And also it increases, it reduces the lead time, and it also prevents the last minute rush and improves the debuggability of any bugs that come that are found in the cycle. This is the advantage of having a total build time, right? Now we will go to the third pair. Kiran will take over the first metric in the third pair. Over to you, Kiran.
Yeah. So now we discussed two pairs of metrics. One, one bad, and if it is bad, what is a good metric? So the same pattern here also we are continuing. The first metric is bugs per developer. Now, what exactly is bugs per developer, right? We'll just show you a chart. How does it look? So there is a team, and the team has 4 developers, and over a period of time, what they did, they measured number of bugs created by each developer. So let's say there was some feature developed by John, and they put into prod, and after some time they understood, okay, this feature has like 2 bugs. Okay, John, you get the count 2, and the graph is plotted over a period of time. And when you see this, what you see is uh, the number of bugs created by developer. It kind of shows the number of mistakes you committed over a period of time. If you see, Mary looks like she's creating a lot of bugs, right? And you don't need to blame also. Like, why we have given that the tag blame the bug creator is, it's like showing to everyone that these are the bugs that's created, and these are the names that is created there. So this is how it typically looks. And why is this a bad metric? So one is developers won't help each other. So let's say there is, you have a sprint planning, and you took a and you took a story, and you're only thinking about your story because you're afraid that you may create a bug. So, and you're only worried about how can I not create a bug. So you're working out of fear instead of thinking about other teammates as well, the whole sprint goal. How can I help my other teammates? How can I make the sprint success? How to achieve the sprint goal? Let's think about overall sprint goal. So the mindset will only be towards not creating bugs, and that will have a negative impact, right? And apart from that, instead of fixing bugs, developer will concentrate on blaming each other. So let's say we got a production bug, and if the team is good, if they have good team culture, they immediately get together and try to fix the bug. And instead, in this case, what happens, since developers are measured by the number of bugs they created, first they'll think, okay, did I create this bug? Okay, if I created, no, then who created? Let me first catch hold of the person who created the bug. So instead of fixing the bug, so the team thinks about who created the bug, and plan to blame that person, and then they think about fixing the bug. And yeah, and the same thing, like the previously also, even in build failure count, similarly this was the case. So team will take only less risky items since they're afraid of build since they are afraid of build failures and any defect they may create. So they are they are constantly worried that let's say there is a feature which product owner showed in front of the team, and but it gives a very good business value, but it is having a lot of uncertainties and little difficulty, and now the team is sort of taking a step back because they don't want to come into the chart. They don't want their chart to look bad, so they're always worried about not taking the risky items. So now, since this is a bad metric, what can be used instead of this?
Okay, so what can be used instead of, it could be either bugs per developer or bugs per team, or you can just find out how many bugs the product has created. Still, it will instill the same effect on the developers. Or even sometimes we have seen, people trying to leave the developers and think, testers are important. Testers are the responsible people for quality. We'll go and find which tester tested this feature, and we'll go and put that against that person. That is another, scenario that we have seen. So instead of finding out, bugs per person, maybe developer or tester or whoever it is, there is another thing that you can measure, which is called support case density, in order to again improve your engineering excellence culture, right? So what is support case density? Support case density is nothing but this is measured per feature, or even any valuable item that you ship in a release. So for each item you ship in a release, what you do is you find out the number of support tickets that are created, and you will not get support tickets on day one of the deployment. So what you have to do, in order to measure this metric, you have to define a waiting period. So you will, it's the typical waiting period that it depends on how frequently people are adopting the product, right? So it could be, let's say people can choose to wait. Okay, I'll wait for a month before reporting this metric for a feature, right? And retrospectively look at the feature and try to learn from it. That's something that you can do. So let's say you wait for 1 month after the deployment of that feature or after the release of that feature. You find out how many support tickets are created related to that feature, and you divide that by the size of the feature, right? When you say size of the feature, it could be the size that teams are given story points, and that becomes a good proxy for the size of the feature. So for example, let's say a feature has 5 story points, and after a waiting period of 1 month or whatever be the waiting period, number of support cases that were created is 2. So the support case density for that particular feature is 2 divided by 5 is equal to 0.4 is the support case density. And how do people use it? They use it by reporting on a release. For each release that you have a chart saying this is the threshold that the team aims for, team's agreed threshold, and you plot the support case density number, right? And now if you see, since you divided everything by the size, you can find, around the same range most of the things if everything goes well. If you do not divide it by the size, then these are not good normalizers. That's why we divide it by the size. So if you see the 0.1 0.15 0.05 like this number can be there, and each feature will have its own support case density. And what we do is retrospectively we look at this chart for maybe a release after the waiting period, and find out what are the improvement items that we can do, so that we can improve, so that we can get less support cases, right? When I say support cases, it includes sometimes production defects, it can include usability problems, it can include questions of, hey, I don't know how to use this, can you help me use this? Or this feature is difficult to use, and I want you to do this instead of the services request typically, right? These kind of things can happen. So why this is a good metric instead of having a bugs per person kind of a metric? First thing is it promotes thinking from a user's perspective. The person who talks to the customer at the end of the day is a support representative if you have a separate support team. And what you're doing is you're just trying to get the feedback that a support member gets and trying to pass it back to the development team. If you see in the 3 ways of DevOps, this does the second way. Second way of DevOps is basically creating a feedback loop, right? And this is basically helping you to create a feedback loop of how the user is feeling whenever he uses the software, what questions he's getting, and directly channeling it back to the development team, or directly channeling it back to the engineering team, the team that created that product at the first place. That's one. And second thing is, in the previous measure, you are only worried about defects, right? And defects are subjective, right? Defects could be, you can always, you can see go to any software company, you can always find that at least 10% of the time they spend their time arguing on whether something is a defect or not, right? Bug or a feature or a feature, a lot of things. These arguments are very common in software companies. So, but when you talk about the user's perspective, right? Since you are taking support tickets instead of just the defects, what you get is you get a holistic view of both defects and the usability problems, right? So you go back and see, hey, we created this usability issue. Maybe we can avoid this in the next release. These are some things that can happen. So these are the two predominant reasons why instead of just measuring bugs, we want to measure the support case. So there are some organizations which have something called production defect density. So instead of production defect density, or maybe measure that, right, without attributing it to teams, also measure production support case density, right? How many support cases you are getting in the production when somebody's some releases deployed to the production, right, after the waiting period. That's pretty much the why this is a good metric. So now we have come to the end of the talk. Very much 2 minutes or more for the 45 minutes so that we can get into the question hour. So in summary, what we discussed today is that we discussed, instead of measuring something, measure something else, right? So we worked on 3 pairs of metrics. So the first pair is, instead of measuring code coverage, measure mutation coverage. This was the first pair of metrics. So code coverage, the problem was that it was not testing the quality of test. It was just telling whether somebody is writing tests or not, right? It does not tell you whether good quality tests are being written. Whereas mutation coverage will tell you the quality of the test also, in addition to whether somebody is giving tests or not. So that is why it is advantageous to measure mutation coverage, right, instead of code coverage, or at least do it in addition to code coverage. If your organization, let's say they say that we want code coverage as an organization standard, don't go and fight them. Say, okay, here is your code coverage, but in addition to that, we will measure mutation coverage, right? So this is another tip that we have learned when we are trying to transform teams by changing their practices. So whenever a leadership or management or some standardization groups ask for a report, don't fight against it. We give them what they want, but in addition to that, do something else and start presenting that also. So if people are asking, give me velocity chart, don't say I will not give velocity chart. Say I will give you velocity chart, but in addition to that, I will give you support case density also. Right now, what happens is that you can create a conversation around both these metrics in the in the forum there where it is getting, where you are seeing this thing. So instead of code coverage, measure mutation coverage is the first takeaway. Second takeaway is, instead of measuring build failure count and trying to reduce it over a period of time, measure total build rate time and try to promote a culture of fixing things rather than creating a culture of blaming things. That is one. And the third thing that we spoke about is bugs per developer or bugs per team or bugs per person or bugs per whatever, right? Instead of measuring that, you can measure support case density, because it talks about the user's view from the perspective of how the user sees the product quality. It's basically the user's subjective view of product quality rather than somebody else's view of product quality. That's the whole point. And this is all what we want you to take away from this, right? And here ends our,
Just adding to
talk. Yeah.
what Vivek said, it's if you see the technical excellence, it's so much more to do with the culture as well. Like we observed in each case, the team culture brings in quality as well into the product. So that is one of the uh, takeaway from the summary. I mean, from the talk, we would say. Yep. Thank you for your time.
Thank you,
Any
Vivek. Thank you, Kiran. So there are a couple of questions. One question that I will straight away read out. Which languages do mutation test support as it changes the code?
Good. So each language has their own mutation testing code. For example, for Java, you have PyTest, right? And there are two tools that we showed here. Maybe I'll just go and show this thing. So there is, oh my God, okay. Sorry. So there is Striker Mutator. This is for Node.js, right? Anything that has a JavaScript based code base, you can use it. For React code, you can use Striker Mutator, for that example. Anything that has a JavaScript base, you can use Striker Mutator. PyTest is for Java based code. And for .NET, there is some other tool. So for any popular programming language, right, you can find some mutation testing tool that is available, and that can be directly integrated to your code with, just it's as good as writing a command to start the test with your test code. You don't have to do any other extra stuff in order to do that. So almost all pretty popular mainstream languages have some mutation testing tool. Google it, you will find it. You may not find a mutation testing tool for probably C++ and all, not the VC++, but C++ or, traditional languages like, COBOL and all these things. Maybe you will find it, but I don't believe or I do not have much trust on that process. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Okay, so there is one more question, Vivek. This is, I think, going a step back in terms of taking a step back and taking a broader view, like the test-driven development, how do you introduce? Okay, so I think what we were talking about was how the tests were, but then if there were no tests, if there are no tests.
Okay. Okay. Let me try to attempt to answer that question, because it all depends on the context in which the team is already working, and what are the things that the team is already measured on. But the first step, whether whatever be the case, is to start with. So there is a difference between test first development and test driven development. So test first is basically writing or thinking about test cases even before the first line of code is written. So let's say there are 10 test cases, you write all the 10 test cases and then start writing code. That is test first development. So if you're if you have a huge manual test cases, if you do not have much automated test cases, then you can even have a test case creation in Excel sheet, write 10 test cases, give it to the developer, and use that as a, developer can use that as a guide to develop. That is the first step in, introducing test driven development. But then after that, if your technology supports, let's say you're working on again mainstream technologies, then you can start, working with somebody who has already done that, right? You can watch some videos. There are a lot of good YouTube videos on test driven development, and there are people who live code and show you how to do test driven development. If you are doing that, each and every developer can pair and learn test driven development. That's another thing that you can do. But I will never be able to answer this question holistically, because there are a lot of variables that come into the play. How does a manager behave? How does the team, developer culture, and a lot of things. But these are some things that you can start with possibly.
Sure, Vivek. Two more questions that I see on the screen. Are monitoring number of crashes per project a good metric to monitor?
Kiran, do you want to take that?
Sorry, crashes per project.
Number of crashes per project, is it a good metric to monitor?
Something like number of incidents, number of times something broke on production.
I think downtime, it means downtime. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say project. For a product, if you measure, I think it's a good metric. Like what was the downtime over a period of time? I think it's a good metric. And some things already used, like, it should be available 99% of the time.
So adding to what Kiran said, number of crashes again belongs to the same category as your, you say build red count. I'm just going to that. Yeah, build failure count. Right? Whereas what Kiran suggested, downtime measurement, belongs to the opposite category, which is nothing but our, maybe I'll go to the last slide, that way it's easy. It belongs to the total build red time category, right? So you can always measure number of crashes and try to reduce that over a period of time. But no matter what we do, it will always have a idea that crashes are bad, which indeed they are bad, but they will induce a system of, okay, by who created this crash and all. But if you're trying to reduce the downtime, then you will promote fixing culture, right? So if you're able to do that number of crashes without creating blame, that is a good thing. Otherwise, directly measure this downtime in some way and try to improve how quickly we react, because that's what ultimately matters to the customer also. Your customer does not, he does not want, he may not even have the data of how many crashes happen, but he will be always interested in the, how much downtime happened. That's what the customer's perspective behavior. That's another take on the answer to the question.
Any more
Okay,
questions?
one more question. How are mutation test cases different from negative test cases written using JUnit or Mockito, etc.?
Very good question. Just that negative test cases are written by you. The human being writes the test cases, and there is a limit on how many number of test cases a human being can write. That is one. Second thing, and mutation test cases, the test cases are written by human, but the mutations are done by the tool. It's automated. So I'll just go back to that slide. Sorry about that. So here, if you see, the tool changes the code, right? The mutations are created by the tool in the code, not in the test cases. Test cases remain the same. The mutation testing tool will never touch your test case. It will never modify your test case. It will not add test cases to your, code. It will just change your code in some places to check whether your test cases are okay or not, right? When you're writing your negative test cases, what you're trying to do is you will not alter the code. You will just keep on adding more tests in the test suite, right? So in short, mutation test tools change the code and see whether test case passes or fails. But your negative test cases just keep adding more, tests, and they're written by humans, right? And both are necessary. I would say if you have good negative test coverage, then your mutation coverage will be also high. That's the idea. So we need both. It's not either or situation. I'm not sure if I confused my answer.
I got it when you mentioned it. So hopefully the one who asked this question also would have understood. Like, so if anybody have any other question, please feel free to shoot your question.
I see one question here from Gopal, right?
In chat?
I'm not sure. Yeah, in chat, I'm seeing one question.
Okay.
That culture of blame someone who caused red build is bad. Is it prevalent and common in many companies? Right? This is one question that I'm seeing. You want to take a stab, Kiran?
I mean, what I have seen is it is not that common. First, to have a build server setup that itself, not every majority of the team has. But yeah, I mean, wherever we have automated build server, I think this sort of blends there. That measurement, what I've seen.
So it depends on, whether people understand that, whether red builds are totally due to the people or is it because of some other factors. It comes out of ignorance most of the times, where people wrongly believe that that person did something wrong, that's why the build failed. When people have that understanding, then they go for blame. But when they understand that the 21 reasons which I showed, right, if they understand some aspects of how a build failure could not mean a developer fault, then they go to the point where, okay, let's try to find out what happens and all these things. My personal experience is this. And there is another question that I'm seeing.
Yeah, there is one more, which is a continuation of the question around JUnit and negative test cases. So it looks like an opinion, might be a question as well. We will have more control of what we want in case of negative test cases, which is missing in mutation testing.
Yes, that is intentional. So we are not going to compare negative test cases versus mutation testing, right? Negative test cases are something that you write, and these are the tests that you should write. Nobody is saying you should not write negative test cases. But let us say you wrote negative test cases, you wrote positive test cases, and if is there a tool that can tell you whether you wrote good negative test cases or good positive test cases? Right? Mutation testing can give you that certificate or stamp of approval that, okay, I changed the code and your negative test case failed when I changed the code. So you wrote a good negative test case or you wrote a good positive test case. So this mutation testing tool, think of it as, elderly person sitting in the corner and judging whatever you're doing and giving you, hey, very good, or too bad, too bad. So mutation testing just does that role.
Okay.
It's not an either or situation.
Yeah, I think let this be the final question that we take, Vivek, in the interest of time. For getting a good support case density, shouldn't there be a metric to track through the engineering phase? I think by engineering phase, the person who's asking this question means while you're developing it.
It's a question of leading metric versus lagging indicator, right?
Mhm.
So by the time we measure the support case density and we know that it is bad, it is already too late. We have already caused a damage to create a lot of support case tickets, right?
Yeah.
Instead
Yeah.
of that, can we do something in order to do during the engineering phase in order to, can we measure?
Yeah.
I do not know of any metric that can capture usability. Maybe, if you have, I don't know. I don't know of any metric, that can capture the usability aspect. We can do something around, accessibility testing. Those things are there, but the core subjective first-person usability experience of a product, I'm not sure any metric can capture that well in engineering phase, unless you have a UAT testing that people are doing nowadays, right? Not nowadays. It's an old practice. UAT testing, then the defects or anything that is found during UAT testing could be a thing, but it also has some loopholes. It does not, help you prevent a usability problem. That's why we thought it's only possible to learn from what has happened, so we use that. But this is an interesting question, right? It's a learning for me also. I'll also go and research, and if I find something, I'll write a blog post about it.
Okay. All right then. So looking forward to hosting you all again in our next webinar. We will announce it shortly. And thank you, Vivek. Thank you, Kiran, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.